The smoke filled his lungs as he pushed the B-25 Mitchell bomber closer to the churning waves. At just 15 feet above the Bismarck Sea, Captain Edwin Lerner could feel the salt spray hitting the underside of his aircraft as he lined up the massive Japanese cruiser in his sights. It was March 3, 1943, and everything about what he was doing defied conventional military doctrine. Pilots simply did not fly multi-ton bombers at wave-top height directly at heavily armed warships. Yet here he was, leading a squadron of modified bombers on what many considered a suicide mission. "Steady! Steady!" he called into the interphone, his voice barely audible over the roar of twin engines pushed to their limits. The massive Japanese vessel loomed larger in his windscreen, its anti-aircraft guns erupting in deadly arcs of tracer fire that sliced through the air around his aircraft. Behind him, 11 other pilots followed his lead, their planes spread out in a deadly formation, racing toward the Japanese convoy. In the bombardier's compartment, Lieutenant Joseph Cheshire's hand hovered over the bomb release. The specialized 500-pound bombs they carried had been fitted with delayed action fuses, a controversial modification that many senior officers had opposed. 300 yards, 200, Ardamon Lerner called out, as deck gunners aboard the Japanese cruiser poured concentrated fire at the approaching American bombers. What happened in the next 60 seconds would forever change naval warfare and seal the fate of 6 Japanese cruisers caught in the open waters of the Bismarck Sea. No one in the 5th Air Force knew that one man's defiance of conventional bombing tactics that morning would rewrite battlefield history, sending over 3,000 Japanese soldiers to watery graves and dealing Imperial Japan a blow from which it would never recover in the New Guinea campaign. Edwin Lerner's path to that fateful moment began in the small farming community of Meridian, Idaho, in 1917. The son of a wheat farmer and a schoolteacher, young Lerner developed an early fascination with machinery and flight. His father, Harold Lerner, had served briefly in the Great War, returning with stories of the first primitive aircraft that had flown reconnaissance missions over the trenches of France. As a boy, Edwin spent countless hours crafting model airplanes from scrap wood and paper, testing their flight characteristics by launching them from the hayloft of his family's barn. His mother, Eleonora, encouraged his passion for mathematics and physics, often finding him asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by calculations and diagrams. "That boy sees the world differently," she once told a neighbor. "He doesn't just look at how things are. He sees how they could be." This innovative mindset served Lerner well when the family fell on hard times during the Great Depression. At just 16, he devised a mechanical seed-spreading apparatus that allowed his father to plant fields more efficiently, saving precious fuel and time. When the local hardware store began selling the Lerner seeder to other farmers, it provided enough extra income for the family to keep their farm. In 1938, with war clouds gathering in Europe and Asia, Lerner enrolled in engineering studies at the University of Idaho. His professors quickly recognized his aptitude for aeronautical concepts. When one instructor mentioned the Army Air Corps was seeking technically minded recruits, Lerner didn't hesitate. He enlisted in early 1941, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor would thrust America into global conflict. Basic flight training revealed Lerner's natural aptitude for aviation. While many cadets struggled with the complex mechanics of aircraft control, Lerner approached flying as an extension of the physics principles he'd studied. His instructors noted his unusual calm under pressure and his ability to calculate trajectories and fuel consumption with remarkable accuracy. "Most pilots feel their way through maneuvers," wrote Captain Nathaniel Westbrook in Lerner's evaluation. Lerner understands the mathematics behind them. This makes him both precise and adaptable in ways that instinct alone cannot achieve. By mid-1942, now Lieutenant Lerner had completed advanced training on twin-engine aircraft and received orders to join the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. As he departed for his deployment, his father pressed a pocket compass into his palm, a gift that would later prove unexpectedly valuable. "Trust your calculations, but never forget to check your heading," the elder Lerner advised. "Sometimes the simplest tool is the one that brings you home." He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for Lerner and his fellow airmen in the skies above the Bismarck Sea. Upon arriving in Port Moresby, New Guinea, in August 1942, Lerner found himself assigned to the 38th Bombardment Group, a unit transitioning from the older B-26 Marauder to the newer B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The chaotic conditions of the forward air base were a shock to the methodical young officer. Supply shortages meant aircraft often flew with jury-rigged repairs, while the oppressive tropical heat and humidity made even routine operations challenging. Lerner's first combat missions involved conventional medium-altitude bombing runs against Japanese installations. The results were disappointing. Dropping bombs from 10,000 feet in the turbulent air over the jungle-covered mountains of New Guinea often meant missing targets by hundreds of yards. After one particularly frustrating mission, where an entire squadron failed to hit a Japanese supply dump, Lerner approached his squadron commander with an unorthodox suggestion. "Sir, what if we went in lower, much lower?" The commander, Major Gregory Davenport, initially dismissed the idea as suicidal. Flying bombers at low altitude would expose them to intense ground fire without the protection that higher altitudes provided. But Lerner persisted, producing calculations showing how accuracy improved exponentially as altitude decreased. "I'm not talking about 5,000 feet, Lerner explained. "I mean 500 feet or less." Davenport's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. "You realize what you're suggesting borders on insubordination, Lieutenant? Our orders specify medium-altitude approaches." "With all due respect, sir, our orders aren't working," Lerner replied. "We're wasting bombs and fuel, and the Japanese are still receiving supplies." Davenport might have ended the conversation there. But he had lost his younger brother at Pearl Harbor. If there was a better way to strike at the Japanese, he wanted to hear it. "Put it in writing, Lieutenant. Full analysis, risks and benefits. On my desk, tomorrow." This exchange marked the beginning of Lerner's reputation as an unconventional thinker, a designation that brought both admiration and suspicion from his peers. Some saw him as dangerously reckless, while others recognized a brilliance that might help break the stalemate in the Pacific theater. "Lerner's either going to get a medal or a court-martial," his navigator, Lieutenant Harold Cunningham, observed, "probably both on the same day." The New Guinea campaign represented a critical juncture in the Pacific War. After the naval victory at Midway in June 1942 had halted Japanese expansion in the Central Pacific, the Allied forces under General Douglas MacArthur launched a counteroffensive aimed at pushing the Japanese back from their advanced positions on the northern coast of New Guinea. If successful, this would eliminate the threat to Australia and provide a stepping stone for the eventual recapture of the Philippines. The rugged, mountainous terrain of New Guinea made ground operations exceptionally difficult. Dense jungles, swamps, and near impassable mountain ranges meant that whoever controlled the air and sea lanes would have a decisive advantage in supplying their forces. By early 1943, the Japanese were increasingly dependent on maritime convoys to sustain their garrisons at Lae and Salamaua on the northeastern coast of New Guinea. These convoys typically departed from Rabaul, the major Japanese base on the island of New Britain, and traveled the 600 miles across the Bismarck Sea to reach the New Guinea coast. The journey usually took 2 to 3 days, during which the ships were vulnerable to Allied air attack. Previous Allied attempts to interdict these convoys had achieved only limited success, with bombers operating from medium or high altitudes struggling to hit moving ships. The Japanese were aware of this vulnerability, but considered it acceptable compared to the alternative, abandoning their New Guinea garrisons entirely. To minimize risk, they typically provided strong naval escorts for their transport ships and timed movements to coincide with periods of bad weather when Allied air operations would be hampered. In late February 1943, intelligence reports indicated that a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul. Allied codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered Japanese naval communications, revealing that the 18th Army headquarters in Rabaul was planning to send the 51st Division, approximately 7,000 combat troops, to reinforce Lai. This would be one of the largest single troop movements attempted by the Japanese in the region. General George C. Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized this as a potential opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. If the Allied air forces could destroy this convoy, it would not only eliminate a substantial portion of Japanese combat power, but might force the enemy to abandon shipborne reinforcement altogether. "We need to hit them with everything we've got," Kenney told his staff. "Every bomber, every fighter. This convoy cannot reach Leh." The Allied plan called for a coordinated attack involving heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, medium bombers, B-25 Mitchells, light bombers, A-20 Havocs, and fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks. Royal Australian Air Force Bristol Beaufighters would also participate, providing additional low-level strike capability. What made this operation different from previous convoy interdictions was Kenney's willingness to embrace innovative tactics, specifically the low-level attack approach that officers like Lerner had been advocating. But even Kenney couldn't have anticipated how dramatically these new methods would alter the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific. "If we succeed," he told his commanders, "we'll change the entire equation in New Guinea. If we fail, we may lose our best chance to turn the tide." The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on February 28, 1943. It consisted of 8 transport ships carrying approximately 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. The Japanese plan was to sail under cover of darkness and bad weather, hoping to minimize exposure to Allied air attacks. Initially, the plan seemed to work. Storms in the Solomon and Bismarck seas limited Allied reconnaissance flights, and the convoy remained undetected for its first day at sea. However, on the afternoon of March 1st, a patrolling B-24 Liberator spotted the ships approximately 300 miles northwest of Rabaul. The stage was set for what would become one of the most one-sided battles of the Pacific War and a turning point in the application of air power against naval forces. The weather was worsening by the minute as Captain Edwin Lerner and his crew prepared for their first mission against the Japanese convoy. Heavy rain pelted the aluminum skin of their B-25 Mitchell bomber as ground crews loaded the specially modified bombs into the aircraft's bay. Unlike standard missions where bombers carried dozens of smaller munitions for pattern bombing, each aircraft was being fitted with just 4 500-pound bombs equipped with delayed action fuses. 5-second delay, the armorer explained as he secured the weapons. You drop them close enough to a ship, they'll skip across the water like stones before they hit the hull. Even if they miss, they'll explode underwater and might rupture the keel. Lerner nodded, though privately he wondered if the theory would work in practice. Skip bombing had been tested against stationary targets, but never against moving warships with anti-aircraft guns blazing. The enormity of what they were attempting settled over him as he completed his pre-flight checks. In the briefing tent, tension was palpable as Major Gregory Davenport outlined the mission. Maps showed the current position of the Japanese convoy, now approximately 200 miles north of the New Guinea coast. Intelligence estimated it consisted of 8 transport ships carrying the Japanese 51st Division, protected by 8 destroyers. More concerning were reports that at least 2 cruisers had been identified among the escort vessels. "Gentlemen, I won't sugarcoat this," Davenport said, his voice grave. What we're attempting has never been done before. You'll be flying at mast height, 30 feet or less above the water, directly at ships armed with multiple anti-aircraft batteries. Our calculations suggest that this approach will give the Japanese gunners minimal time to track you, but make no mistake. They will be shooting, and they will be shooting to kill. Around the tent, faces remained impassive, but Lerner noticed several pilots discreetly checking that their lucky charms were secure. Some clutched photographs of loved ones, others fingered religious medals. Lieutenant Joseph Miller, a normally talkative Texan, sat silent, methodically cleaning his wire-rimmed glasses. Captain Lerner will lead the first wave. Davenport continued, his flight has been practicing the skip bombing technique. The rest of you will follow at 30-second intervals. Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force will precede you, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. P-38s will provide top cover against Japanese Zeros. Lerner felt the weight of every eye in the tent as Davenport nodded in his direction. "Captain, anything to add?" Standing, Lerner faced his fellow pilots. Many were younger than his 25 years, their faces bearing the strange mix of youth and premature aging that combat inevitably brought. "The key is timing," he said simply. "We release at 300 yards, no more, no less. Any closer, and we risk being caught in our own explosions. Any farther, and the bombs won't skip properly. Trust your training, trust your crew, and trust the man flying next to you." As the briefing concluded, Chaplain William Garrison offered a brief prayer. Religious or not, every man bowed his head. They all knew that some of them would not return. Outside the tent, Lieutenant Joseph Cheshire, Lerner's bombardier, approached him with concern etched on his face. "Skip, I've been running some additional calculations," Cheshire said, using Lerner's nickname. "The cruisers have a higher freeboard than we anticipated. We may need to adjust our release point." Lerner studied the hastily drawn diagrams Cheshire had prepared. The bombardier was right. The difference between a transport ship and a cruiser meant they would need to alter their approach. It was the kind of detail that could mean the difference between success and failure, life and death. "Good catch," Lerner acknowledged. "We'll release at 250 for cruisers, 300 for transports. Pass it to the others. Quietly. No need to add to pre-mission jitters." As dawn approached on March 2, 1943, the first attack wave took off from Port Moresby. Heavy bombers from the 43rd Bombardment Group, flying at high altitude, located the convoy and dropped their payloads. While they scored only one direct hit, sinking a transport ship, they forced the Japanese vessels to maneuver defensively, disrupting their formation and slowing their progress. Throughout that day and into March 3rd, the weather gradually improved, setting the stage for the decisive engagement that would follow. The low-level attack that Lerner and his fellow pilots had trained for would soon be put to the ultimate test. The pressure was mounting with each passing hour. The question now hanging over the Allied forces: could this untested bombing technique really defeat the combined might of Japanese cruisers and destroyers in open water? Dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, with an eerie calm. The storms that had provided cover for the Japanese convoy had dissipated, leaving a glassy sea surface that reflected the rising sun in blinding patches. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers, the clear weather was an ominous development. It meant Allied aircraft would have perfect visibility. Aboard the Japanese cruiser Nachi, flagship of Rear Admiral Kimura's escort force, lookouts scanned the skies with growing apprehension. The previous day's high-altitude bombing raids had sunk one transport and damaged another, but the convoy had maintained its course toward Leh. Now, with approximately 150 miles remaining in their journey, they were entering the most dangerous phase, within range of the full spectrum of Allied aircraft operating from bases around Port Moresby. At 0800 hours, radar operators aboard the cruiser detected the first wave of approaching Allied aircraft. Initially appearing as small blips at the edge of their detection range, The formations quickly resolved into distinct groups approaching from multiple directions. What the Japanese didn't yet realize was that this wasn't going to be another conventional high-altitude bombing run. It was the beginning of an entirely new form of aerial warfare. The Allied attack plan for March 3rd had been meticulously choreographed. First, B-17 flying fortresses would approach at high altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver and disrupting their tight defensive formation. Next, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters would sweep in at extremely low altitude using their formidable forward-firing cannons and machine guns to suppress anti-aircraft positions. Then would come Lerner's B-25 Mitchells with their skip bombs, followed by A-20 Havocs to attack any remaining vessels. P-38 Lightnings would provide fighter cover throughout, engaging any Japanese aircraft that attempted to intervene. As the massive formation of Allied aircraft approached the convoy, Japanese radio operators frantically called for air support from bases at Rabaul and Lae. But with Allied aircraft maintaining air supremacy in the region, any Japanese fighter response would be too little, too late. At 0930, the first B-17s appeared high overhead, their bomb bay doors opening to release strings of explosives that plummeted toward the convoy. Anti-aircraft guns aboard the Japanese vessels opened fire, sending plumes of black smoke skyward as they attempted to create a protective barrage. The ships began evasive maneuvers, breaking their neat columns and zigzagging unpredictably. Aboard his B-25, now just 20 minutes from the target, Lerner received the radio call he'd been waiting for. "Black Sheep Leader, this is Wallaby. We're commencing our run. Good hunting." The Australians and their Beaufighters had begun their attack. The 13 Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, skimmed the waves at nearly 300 miles per hour, their powerful engines leaving churning wakes in the sea spray below. Each aircraft carried 420mm cannons and 6.303-inch machine guns, all forward-firing and capable of delivering devastating fire against unarmored targets. As they approached the Japanese convoy, the Beaufighter pilots employed a clever tactical deception. Their aircraft resembled Beaufort torpedo bombers, which typically attacked ships from the side to launch torpedoes. When the Japanese gunners saw them approaching, they turned their ships to present their narrower bows, making them smaller targets for torpedoes, but inadvertently perfect targets for the Beaufighters' forward-firing weapons. Streaming toward the Japanese vessels at wave-top height, the Australian aircraft opened fire at 1,000 yards, their cannons and machine guns tearing into the exposed bridge structures and gun positions. Japanese sailors, caught completely by surprise by this unorthodox attack, were cut down at their posts before they could effectively respond. Aboard the cruiser Ioba, the bridge was raked by 20mm cannon fire, killing the captain and most of the command staff in seconds. The Beaufighters roared over the Japanese ships at mast height, their pilots looking up to see the shocked faces of surviving crew members as they passed. Behind them, they left vessels with smoking bridges, disabled gun positions, and chaos on their decks, precisely the conditions needed for the skip bombers to follow. As the last Beaufighter cleared the convoy, Lerner's voice came over the radio to his 11 following aircraft. "Black Sheep Squadron, this is Leader. Commence attack run. Remember your training. Good luck." Pushing his control yoke forward, Lerner descended to just 15 feet above the water, feeling the increased pressure as his airspeed indicator climbed past 270 miles per hour. Behind him, arranged in a loose arrow formation, the other B-25s followed suit. The specially modified bombers, each with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, were about to demonstrate their lethal purpose. Lerner selected the lead cruiser as his target, lining up for a direct approach toward its bow. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire with his nose-mounted machine guns, sending streams of tracer rounds into the vessel's superstructure. The Japanese ship, already damaged by the Beaufighters, returned fire sporadically, but many of its gun positions were unmanned or destroyed. 350 yards, called Lieutenant Cheshire from the bombardier's position. 300, steady. At exactly 250 yards, adjusted for the cruiser's higher freeboard, as they had discussed, Cheshire hit the bomb release. 4 500-pound bombs dropped from the aircraft's bay, their aerodynamic casings designed to skip across water rather than plunge into it. The physics worked exactly as calculated. The bombs struck the water approximately 100 yards from the ship, then bounced like stones, skipped across a pond. 3 projectiles struck the cruiser's hull at the waterline, while the 4th overshot, exploding in the water beyond. Due to their 5-second delay fuses, the bombs didn't detonate immediately on impact but penetrated the hull before exploding inside the vessel. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese cruiser. The internal explosions tore through bulkheads and compartments, igniting ammunition and fuel stores. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as Lerner's B-25 roared overhead, banking sharply to avoid the debris and smoke now erupting from the stricken vessel. Behind him, the other bombers executed similar attacks on the remaining ships. Lieutenant Roland Matson targeted the second cruiser, his bombs skipping perfectly to strike amidships. Lieutenant Joseph Miller's aircraft hit a transport ship loaded with troops, the resulting explosion so violent that debris struck Miller's bomber, shattering his right waist gunner's window. Within 3 minutes of the first skip bombing attack, 3 Japanese cruisers were burning fiercely, their superstructures shattered by internal explosions. A 4th took multiple hits from Lieutenant Franklin Nehart's bomber, leaving it listing heavily to port. 2 transport ships had been hit directly and were rapidly sinking, while others had suffered varying degrees of damage. As Lerner banked his aircraft to observe the results, he was astonished by the devastation. The skip bombing technique, combined with the strafing runs by the bow fighters, had achieved in minutes what conventional high-altitude bombing had failed to accomplish in months of trying. "Black Sheep leader to control," Teehee radioed. "Multiple direct hits. Repeat, multiple direct hits." At least 3 cruisers and 2 transports confirmed burning or sinking. The reply came back almost immediately. "Roger, Black Sheep, well done. Be advised, Havocs are inbound to finish the job. Return to base." As Lerner's bombers turned for home, the squadron of A-20 Havoc light attack aircraft arrived to continue the assault. Like the B-25s, they employed skip bombing tactics, but targeted the remaining Japanese destroyers and transports that had escaped the initial wave. By 1100 hours, just 90 minutes after the coordinated attack began, the results were clear. The Japanese convoy had been annihilated. 6 cruisers were either sunk or burning beyond salvation. 7 of the 8 transport ships were sinking, their decks crowded with Japanese soldiers desperately trying to abandon ship. The few remaining destroyers, themselves damaged, were occupied with rescuing survivors rather than continuing to lay. In the span of less than 2 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered one of its most catastrophic defeats of the war, not at the hands of battleships or aircraft carriers, but from land-based bombers employing tactics that defied conventional military doctrine. As Captain Edwin Lerner guided his B-25 back toward Port Moresby, the adrenaline of combat began to subside, replaced by the sobering realization of what they had accomplished. From his rear-facing observation blister, Technical Sergeant Wallace Green, the tail gunner, provided an ongoing commentary of the scene behind them. "Skip, you wouldn't believe it," Green called over the interphone. "There's nothing but fire and smoke back there. I count at least 5 ships completely engulfed. The water's full of debris and, no people." Lerner acknowledged the report but said nothing more. The human cost of war was never far from his thoughts, even when that cost was exacted upon the enemy. He had just led an attack that had likely killed thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers, men who, like his own crew, were following orders and serving their country. "How's our girl doing?" he asked Flight Engineer Master Sergeant Clayton Wells, deliberately changing the subject. Port engines running a bit hot, but nothing critical, Wells replied. Some minor shrapnel damage to the starboard wing, but control surfaces are responding normally. We got lucky, Skip. Lucky indeed. Of the 12 aircraft in Lerner's squadron, 10 had returned with varying degrees of damage, but no casualties. Lieutenant Harold Barnett's B-25 had taken heavy fire while targeting a Japanese destroyer, losing an engine and limping back on the remaining one. Lieutenant Robert Sullivan's aircraft was missing entirely, last seen pulling up sharply after dropping its bombs on a cruiser. No parachutes had been observed. As they approached Port Moresby, Lerner could see several aircraft circling the airfield, waiting their turn to land. The control tower was giving priority to damaged bombers, and there were many. A B-17 was making a one-engine landing, its fuselage riddled with holes from anti-aircraft fire. An Australian Beaufighter was coming in with its canopy shattered and one propeller feathered. After landing and taxiing to their hard stand, Lerner's crew was met by Major Davenport, whose face betrayed a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Preliminary reports are coming in," Davenport said, not waiting for Lerner to complete his shutdown checklist. "It's even better than we thought. 6 cruisers confirmed sunk or sinking beyond recovery. 7 transports gone. 1 destroyer confirmed sunk. 3 others heavily damaged. The Japanese 51st Division has effectively ceased to exist." The news was stunning. Never before had land-based aircraft achieved such complete destruction of naval forces in a single engagement. The skip bombing technique that Lerner had championed, combined with the coordinated attack involving multiple aircraft types, had proven devastating against ships that had previously been considered relatively safe from aerial attack. "Any word on Sullivan and his crew?" Lerner asked, his thoughts turning to the missing aircraft. Davenport's expression sobered. "Nothing yet. We've got Catalina searching the return route, but—" He left the sentence unfinished. Both men knew that survival rates for crews downed at sea were distressingly low. As ground crews swarmed around the bomber, examining damage and beginning repairs, Lerner completed his post-flight checks. In the bombardier's compartment, Lieutenant Cheshire was already calculating bomb effectiveness rates based on his observations. "Preliminary numbers suggest 70% direct hits," Cheshire reported. "That's compared to less than 5% for conventional high-altitude bombing. The evidence is irrefutable, Skip. Your approach works." Later that evening, as exhausted crews gathered in the officers' mess, the scale of their achievement began to sink in. General Kenny himself visited briefly, moving from table to table to congratulate the men. When he reached Lerner, he paused longer than with the others. "Captain Lerner," Kenny said, "I understand you were one of the principal advocates for this skip bombing technique." "Yes, sir," Lerner replied, standing respectfully, "though I certainly wasn't alone. Lieutenant Cheshire refined the bomb release calculations, and Major Gunn's modifications to our aircraft made the low-level approach viable." Kenny nodded thoughtfully. "Well, son, sometimes victory goes not to the side with the most men or the most machines, but to the side willing to think differently." He extended his hand. "On behalf of the 5th Air Force, thank you for thinking differently." "Au revoir." As news of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea spread throughout the Allied forces in the Pacific, the implications became increasingly clear. The Japanese attempt to reinforce Leh had failed catastrophically, with fewer than 1,000 troops reaching their destination out of the original 7,000. More significantly, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost a substantial portion of its regional escort capacity in a single engagement. The battle's impact on Japanese strategy was immediate and profound. A staff conference held at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo on March 12th concluded that surface ships could no longer be safely operated within range of Allied aircraft. Future reinforcement of New Guinea would be limited to submarine transport or small fast vessels operating only at night, methods that could move only a fraction of the troops and supplies needed. For the Allies, The victory demonstrated the potential of coordinated air power when employed with innovative tactics. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters issued a communiqué on March 7th, describing the battle as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time, though the statement exaggerated Japanese losses, claiming 22 ships sunk rather than the actual 16. In Washington, the implications were not lost on military planners. The success of land-based aircraft against naval forces suggested new possibilities for the island-hopping campaign that would characterize the Allied advance across the Pacific. If bombers could effectively neutralize Japanese naval power, amphibious landings could be conducted with reduced risk to the precious aircraft carriers that had become the centerpiece of American naval strategy. For Captain Edwin Lerner and his fellow pilots, however, the battle's aftermath brought mixed emotions. The elation of victory was tempered by the loss of comrades and the knowledge that many more battles lay ahead. Lieutenant Sullivan and his crew were never found, presumably lost at sea after their aircraft was damaged in the attack. On March 10th, Lerner was summoned to 5th Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby. Assuming he was being called to provide a detailed after-action report, he was surprised to find himself facing a board of senior officers, including several who had been skeptical of the skip bombing technique. "Captain Lerner," began Colonel Walter Reynolds, "the events of March 3rd have raised significant questions about our bombing doctrine. Your advocacy for low-level attacks, while ultimately successful, involved departing from established protocols and encouraging others to do the same." Lerner felt a chill run down his spine. Was this to be a reprimand rather than a commendation? "The results speak for themselves, sir," he replied carefully. 6 Japanese cruisers and 7 transports sunk, at a cost of 3 bombers and 16 men. Previous conventional attacks had achieved only minimal success at much higher cost. Mawawi Colonel Reynolds exchanged glances with the other officers before continuing. "That's precisely the point, Captain. Your approach achieved results that conventional doctrine could not. The question before us is whether this represents a tactical anomaly or a fundamental shift in how we should conduct bombing operations against naval targets." What followed was a 3-hour technical debriefing, during which Lerner explained in detail the principles behind skip bombing, the aircraft modifications that had made it possible, and the coordination required with supporting aircraft like the Beaufighters and P-38s. Throughout, he emphasized that the technique's success was not his achievement alone, but represented the collective innovation of many officers and enlisted specialists. At the debriefing's conclusion, Major General Ennis Whitehead, Deputy Commander of the 5th Air Force, addressed Lerner directly. "Captain, based on the results achieved and the technical viability of your approach, we are establishing a dedicated training program for skip bombing techniques. All medium and light bomber squadrons in the 5th Air Force will be trained in these methods." He paused, allowing the significance to sink in. "You will assist in developing the training curriculum before returning to your squadron." The implications were clear. The unorthodox technique that had been viewed with suspicion by many senior officers was now being institutionalized as standard doctrine. It represented a rare instance where bottom-up innovation had overcome the military's traditional resistance to change. 2 weeks later, as Lerner was completing his work on the training program, he received orders that both surprised and concerned him. He was being reassigned to the United States, where he would help establish similar training programs for bomber groups preparing to deploy to the Pacific. "I don't understand, sir," he told Major Davenport when handed the orders. "My place is here, with my squadron." Davenport shook his head. "It's precisely because of what you accomplished here that you're needed back home. The skip bombing technique has been approved for theater-wide implementation. That means thousands of pilots need to learn it, and quickly. But my crew will continue the fight under Lieutenant Cheshire's command. He's being promoted to captain effective immediately." Lerner felt conflicted. On one hand, his innovation was being recognized and adopted on a scale he had never imagined. On the other, he was being removed from the combat zone just as the tide was turning against the Japanese. "Skip," Davenport said, using Lerner's nickname for the first time. "Sometimes the most important contribution a soldier can make isn't firing a weapon, but teaching others how to fire theirs more effectively. What you've done here will save countless Allied lives and hasten the end of this war. That's worth more than any additional missions you might fly personally." Reluctantly, Lerner accepted the wisdom in Davenport's words. Before departing New Guinea, he visited each member of his crew individually, thanking them for their trust and courage. To Lieutenant, now Captain, Cheshire, he handed over his notebook containing detailed calculations and observations about the skip bombing technique. "Keep refining it," he told his former bombardier. "There's always room for improvement." As Lerner's transport aircraft lifted off from Port Moresby on April 2, 1943, he looked down at the harbor where dozens of bombers were being modified with additional forward-firing guns and strengthened bomb bays to accommodate the skip bombing technique. The improvisational adaptation he had championed was now becoming standard equipment. For the remainder of 1943 and into 1944, Captain Edwin Lerner traveled between bombing schools across the United States, instructing pilots and bombardiers in the technique that had proven so devastating in the Bismarck Sea. His classroom presentations always began with the same statement: "What I'm about to teach you defies conventional doctrine, but it works, and in war, results matter more than tradition." By mid-1944, skip bombing had become standard practice for medium bomber operations throughout the Pacific Theater. B-25 Mitchells, specifically modified for the role with up to 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, were dubbed strafers and used to devastating effect against Japanese shipping from the Philippines to Formosa. The long-term consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The Japanese Navy's inability to reinforce its garrisons in New Guinea led directly to Allied ground victories at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. By September 1943, the strategic initiative in the Southwest Pacific had decisively shifted to the Allies, allowing MacArthur to begin his long-promised return to the Philippines. For Japan, the battle represented more than just the loss of ships and men. It signaled the collapse of their entire strategic position in the Southwest Pacific. Unable to supply their forward bases adequately, Japanese forces found themselves increasingly isolated and outmatched. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already reeling from earlier defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, now faced the sobering reality that even their cruisers and destroyers were vulnerable to land-based air attack. Captain Lerner returned to combat operations in the Pacific in early 1945, commanding a squadron of B-25 strafers operating from the newly recaptured Philippines. By then, the skip bombing technique had been further refined with specialized aircraft modifications and improved bombs designed specifically for the purpose. What had begun as an improvised tactic had evolved into a fundamental component of Allied air power. After the war, Lerner rarely spoke of his role in developing the technique that had helped turn the tide in the Pacific. When pressed, he would deflect credit to others, particularly to those who had not survived to see victory. Lieutenant Sullivan and his crew, lost during the Bismarck Sea battle, remained especially prominent in his memory. In 1953, during the 10th anniversary commemoration of the battle, a journalist from the Associated Press tracked Lerner down at his engineering firm in Seattle, where he had established a successful career designing commercial aircraft components. "Mr. Lerner," the journalist began, "many historians now consider the Battle of the Bismarck Sea a turning point in the Pacific War, and your development of skip bombing as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the conflict. How does it feel to have changed the course of history?" Lerner considered the question carefully before responding. "Innovation in warfare is never about glory, Harspaf," he said finally. "It's about solving problems when conventional approaches fail. We faced a problem. Japanese ships were getting through despite our best efforts to stop them. The solution wasn't to do what we'd been taught harder or better. It was to try something fundamentally different." He paused, his gaze distant, as if looking back across the years to that fateful day above the Bismarck Sea. If there's a lesson there, it's that sometimes the most valuable contribution a person can make is questioning established wisdom. The Japanese expected us to attack from high altitude, following doctrine. When we came in at wave-top height instead, we caught them completely unprepared. The journalist nodded, making notes. "And the cost? You lost friends implementing this new approach." "Every innovation in war carries risk," Lerner acknowledged. "The 16 men we lost during the battle were heroes, without question. But consider the alternative. Continuing with high-altitude bombing would have meant more Japanese reinforcements reaching New Guinea, leading to longer, bloodier ground campaigns. Thousands more Allied soldiers might have died. In war, there are no perfect choices, only better and worse ones." In the years following the war, military historians increasingly recognized the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a watershed moment in air power history. It demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft, properly employed, could defeat naval forces even without the support of friendly ships. This lesson would influence military doctrine for decades to come, shaping the development of anti-ship missiles and precision-guided munitions. For the men who had participated in the battle, however, it represented something more personal, a moment when innovative thinking and calculated risk-taking had achieved what conventional approaches could not. In the crucible of combat, they had broken with tradition and written a new chapter in military history. Captain Edwin Lerner's wartime innovation continued to influence military aviation long after his death in 1987. The principle of delivering ordnance from extremely low altitude to improve accuracy would find expression in terrain-following radar systems and ultimately in the precision-guided weapons that would characterize air warfare in the late 20th century. Yet perhaps his most enduring legacy lay not in the specific technique he had helped develop, but in his willingness to question established doctrine when it proved ineffective. In a letter found among his personal effects after his death, addressed to his grandchildren but never sent, Lerner had written, "The most dangerous words in any profession are, 'We've always done it this way.' Progress demands that we constantly evaluate whether traditional methods remain the best approach, or whether innovation might yield better results. This is true in peace no less than in war." The skip bombing technique worked because it challenged assumptions about how bombers should attack ships. The lesson isn't about bombing at all, it's about having the courage to see problems differently when conventional wisdom fails. Today, military training academies around the world study the Battle of the Bismarck Sea not just as a tactical case study, but as an object lesson in the value of adaptive thinking in warfare. The battle stands as a reminder that victory often goes not to the side with superior numbers or equipment, but to the side willing to innovate and adapt more effectively. And so, in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, where 6 Japanese cruisers and 7 transport ships lie in their watery graves, there remains a permanent monument to what happens when one person's bold idea, initially dismissed as reckless, transforms the rules of warfare. It is a testament to the power of innovation and the difference that one individual's courage can make in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The next time you find yourself confronted with a problem that seems unsolvable through conventional means, remember Captain Edwin Lerner and the pilots who skimmed the waves of the Bismarck Sea at 15 feet, defying both gravity and military doctrine to achieve what many had deemed impossible. Remember that sometimes the path to victory lies not in doing things the way they've always been done, but in having the courage to try something different, even when that means flying directly into the face of danger. Would you have had the courage to fly at wave-top height toward ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns? Would you have broken with established doctrine when lives hung in the balance? Would you have risked your career and reputation to champion an unproven technique that defied conventional wisdom? These are questions worth considering, for they speak to something fundamental about human progress and innovation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reminds us that history is shaped not just by those who follow orders, but by those who dare to imagine better ways forward. Comment below and share this story so others remember what true courage really means, not just the physical bravery to face enemy fire, but the moral courage to challenge established thinking when lives are at stake.